When the 1st Battalion, 9th Cavalry Regiment landed near Chupong, it managed to capture several North Vietnamese Army soldiers who reported that at least 1,000 more fighters were in the vicinity. Moments later, the battalion was trapped under fire. In an attempt to rescue the battalion, the Americans lost 2 slicks and 15 soldiers. This was bad news for many of us. The strategy of a war of attrition was a never-ending cycle in which we captured the same territory several times over. Connors scolded. You can't plug all the leaks with one finger. Week after week, the press continued to report massive enemy casualties, augmented by the locals, and we knew it. The journals flashed quotes from generals who reported that we had forced the enemy to flee, and quotes from the chief ringleader, Lyndon B. Johnson, who claimed that we had forced the enemy to flee. Johnson, who claimed that victory was just around the corner. The perimeter of the Gulf Zone was now mined. It was illuminated by searchlights, sentries walked it, and sentries stood everywhere. In 7 months, the Viet Cong had been able to move only a few shells and a handful of their soldiers across it. When Oriental ingenuity stumbles over such a difficult obstacle, it often resorts to a semblance of mental judo. The Viet Cong wondered how they would climb aboard American helicopters to study the defenses in detail. Mason, go with Wrestler across the bridge and get some prisoners here, Farris commanded. Gary and I climbed from the 3rd row and flew to a small field in the southeast corner of the perimeter. A second lieutenant ran up to us, holding an M16 rifle by the base of the scope. Take the 2 suspects, he said. He pointed to 2 kids who looked to be about 12 years old. They were smiling. The grunts had given them candy. One of the boys was ineptly puffing on a cigarette. These 2? I asked. Yeah, they were hanging around the perimeter. Maybe they just didn't know they couldn't go out there? They all knew. We're under orders to arrest anyone who gets too close. Take them to jail. Where's that? I asked. You know where the finance department is. Well, there's a barbed wire fence in the field next to it. You can't go wrong. Got it. Charge it. The lieutenant pushed the prisoners toward our chopper. Their faces lit up with genuine childlike delight, and they climbed in. Shouldn't they be blindfolded? Gary asked. No, said the lieutenant. They're kids. One boy sat on the cloth seat, and the other boy sat on the floor with his legs hanging out, the way grunts usually did. Gary and I buckled our seatbelts. Returning to the Gulf area, we deviated from our usual route and circled around the division for a second turn to land. The boys were watching with all eyes. A kid sitting on the floor shoved his comrade and pointed at something. They both laughed. Gary told the dispatcher we were heading toward the pen, whereupon we received the command to descend over the 3rd row and fly on. We crossed the northern perimeter, passed over a military town of grunts, over the gun barrels of our firing positions, over an anti-aircraft radar installation, over the Sikorsky airfield, and over a long row of Hueys. Once behind the heliport, we circled the tent cities and headed toward the field. 2 employees from the guardhouse approached us to receive the detainees. The boys jumped outside with smiles and staggered in the direction indicated. 5 or 6 prisoners were crawling on all 4s under the spiky ceiling of the 3-foot-high cage. One of them waved to the kids. They shouted something cheerfully back. It was a pleasure to be stuck in a place like this, but they explained to us that no one stayed long. We'd interrogate them first, and then either send them home or turn them over to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These 2 little assholes will probably go home, said the officer on duty. As we flew back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just been played for a fool. The boys had scouted the entire 1st Squadron area from the air. The perimeter, lined with barbed wire, landmines, anti-personnel mines, tripwires and observation towers, was constantly infiltrated by weeds. Weeds didn't just spoil the view, they could hide the approach of the enemy. It was decided to send soldiers to spray defoliants from the heights of the hovering Hueys. In the event of engine failure, getting out of the minefield was simply impossible. Given my nervousness about explosives, The possibility of a mine being triggered by the air pressure of a hovering helicopter seemed quite real to me. Add to this the sticks and debris that flew sideways from the air currents of the blades. There was a sea of imaginary threats. Not once did I even consider that the danger might lurk in the defoliant itself. For 2 or 3 days, Ressler and I were successful. It became just another game for us, like any other non-combat flight on the Huey. Do what you want, but don't you dare touch the barbed wire with your skids, Ressler warned us. You think I got my license at a sale? We flew slowly over the rows of barbed wire, passing within millimeters of the short metal posts to which it was attached. The soldier was using a long sprayer. He was spraying a whole cloud of chemicals through it, enveloping the helicopter. When we reached the end of the 300-foot-long fence, we went up slightly, turned around, and headed back down, parallel to the old route, but 10 feet higher. One of the soldiers waved from the cargo bay to the sentry in the observation tower. The sentry waved back and wagged his finger at his temple for good measure. Standing guard was a lot of work, but at least I wasn't an idiot. For 3 hours, Gary and I methodically sprayed every square inch of our assigned area with defoliants. The stuff flew into the cabin, but it had no odor or flavor. The soldiers in the irrigation squad protected themselves with fully buttoned collars and baseball caps pulled over their eyes. One morning we were sent to Yad Drang as a courier helicopter. We were carrying a courier with important documents for all sorts of field commanders. Those were my favorite sorties. No formation flying, no hot landing zones, no screaming grunts, and no red tracers. After crossing Mangyang Pass, we arrived at a tiny landing zone south of Pleiku. The courier jumped out and asked us to turn off the car. We did so, then wandered over to a group of officers who were interrogating a North Vietnamese army soldier. The soldier's hands were tied behind his back. He was shaking his head violently in response to the interpreter's shouts. The burly colonel was getting angry and repeating questions. Behind the prisoner stood a major with a .45 caliber pistol, holding the weapon near his hip. "Tell him to talk, or we'll shoot him," the colonel said. The interpreter from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam smirked. "Tell him." The interpreter put on a menacing sternness, turned sharply and shouted in Vietnamese, backing up his words with gestures. The prisoner twitched at what he heard, but shook his head firmly. "You explained that we would shoot him." "Yes," I said, "you speak now. If you don't speak now, we kill now. Boo." He slammed his fist into the palm of his hand. "That's good. Tell him that again." The translator repeated it, but the prisoner steadfastly refused to speak. "God damn it," yelled the colonel. "Major, put a gun to the back of his head," he said quietly, as if he didn't want to reveal his cards beforehand. "When Nguyen speaks to him again, put the barrel to his head." "Yes, sir." The major raised the gun. The interpreter hurled a torrent of curses at the prisoner, and the major jabbed the barrel of his gun into the back of the soldier's head. The prisoner jerked and closed his eyes, expecting a shot. When the interpreter stopped yelling, he shook his head. "No." The colonel shoved the translator aside and stared at the prisoner. "Listen to me, you sneaky-ass gook. You're going to talk." Right now he glared fiercely. "I'm going to smear your sneaky-ass brains all over this fucking jungle." He moved even closer to the prisoner. "Click the bolt, Major." "Ha!" "Click the goddamn bolt so he can hear. The asshole doesn't believe we can shoot him." "But we can't, sir." The colonel turned sharply to the major. "You and I know that, and he doesn't. Arm it." "Yes, sir." The major gingerly pulled the bolt and released it back. The loud click made the prisoner jerk. It seemed as if he had already resigned himself to death. He lowered his head. The major rested the pistol at the base of his skull. Before the interpreter could ask a question, the prisoner began to shake his head slowly again. "No." All right. "That's enough for now," the colonel said. "Damn those gooks." That's when he saw the courier and Gary and me. "What do you want?" "Delivery from division, sir." The courier handed the colonel a puffy envelope and gave him a military salute. "Okay," the colonel nodded. They'll get it out of the ground with this fucking writing. Yes, so the courier said. The colonel took his eyes off the papers. What else? You'll have to sign for it, sir. Now. As he patted the pockets of his uniform for a pen, he noticed the prisoner's gaze fixed on him. Major, blindfold this yellow ass, and tell him I've decided to execute him. Sir? Do it. Mute. Tell him, go ahead. The colonel shook his head tiredly. Jesus, Major, it's an elementary trick. I'm going to step aside for a moment so that the interpreter can have a friendly word with the gook and promise to try to get his lousy hide out of here. But to do that, he has to talk. You got that? Yes, sir. Here's your signature. The colonel handed the paper to the courier. It's a nice day for flying. The colonel looked at me. Yes, sir, it is, I said. He nodded a couple of times, as if agreeing with several things at once, then stopped abruptly and stared at me. What else? Nothing, sir, I said quickly. We should go. I spit up the blood. I had recently quit smoking, and now the blood was pooling in my mouth near my cheeks. I sat in the mess hall, trying to sort through a pile of paperwork with flight accident reports. I had managed to catch a bad cold, so I was briefly made scribe for the Air Accident Investigation Board. The company was on a sortie somewhere in the vicinity, but rumour had it that we would soon have to go to Turkey Farm for a few days. I was in mixed feelings. This job kept me within the safe walls of the camp, but it was hard to accept being left in the rear, no matter what the reason. It was an idiotic feeling. I was ready to dig through mountains of paperwork just to keep from flying. Why do I feel so lousy? What am I, a puppet? Relax and enjoy it while you can. According to the crew commander, he did not expect the landing zone to be full of hidden stumps, the report read. The aircraft landed directly on a tall, sharp stump, so the vehicle had to be abandoned. Who cares? Why do we have to record every incident in this fucking war? The pilot can't know everything. Or do they think we have X-rays for eyes? Sir, can I sit here? Sergeant Riles was squatting at my table. Sure. He pushed the file folder aside and put the cap of his flask on the empty seat. Just a little break from the fucking supply tent, Riles explained. Hey, tough guys in there. I hated myself for having such a cynical conversation with one of the logistics guys. He was the biggest loser in the whole company. Riles was a whiskey addict who stole whiskey from the crew's stash while they were out on sorties. He used to be a master sergeant, but his drinking got him demoted to private first class. We addressed him sergeant because he was depressed by the word private. Well, it's not that harsh, he laughed. If Riles is a rear guard and a loser, then who am I? I was seized with intense disgust. Sarge, I'd love to chat, but I've got this whole pile to clean up. I got it. Don't mind me. We'll be back soon anyway. I got a memo today telling us to get ready for the inspection. I forced myself to take my eyes off the document. I hate that shit. You ever had one of these inspections? Not once. I don't intend to. Riles stood up, waiting for me to say something. Silence spoke for me, and he finally walked away. I wanted to call out to him and apologize for my thoughts, but I didn't. As the convoy made its way down Route 19, I thought of the British marching confidently into American ambushes. Cook had lent his M16 rifle, which now rested in my lap as I rode in the jeep. I figured my rank was the equivalent of a British red uniform and smelled the collar inside. By virtue of being temporarily suspended from flying, I was the officer in charge of our first convoy headed for Pleiku. The Mobile 100 group also travelled from Anki to Pleiku once, said Wendell. I asked. The French equivalent of the first squad, explained Wendell. They travelled these same roads in a long column to defeat the Viet Minh. The Group 100 were mowed down clean near the Mangyang Pass. Thank you, Wendell. That's great news. Look, it's history. History can teach you a lot, you know. How's that going to help me now? Well, if I were you, I'd stay awake for the trip. Good luck with that. Of course, the big difference was we had patrols all along the road, but that didn't make me any less afraid. I've long been skeptical of safe drop-off zones, roads, bridges, and parking lots. During the 50-mile trip, I constantly watched the elephant grass growing along the road, mentally prepared myself for gunfire in every narrow passageway, and tried to stay slightly elevated above the seat as we crossed bridges. When we arrived at the turkey farm, the first thing I did was to find the aviation doctor and ask to be cleared to fly. "I'm sorry, but your nose is completely stuffed up. Flying will make it worse. Come back in a couple days and we'll see." In the dank fog, about 100 soldiers were pulling bulky general-purpose tents out of trucks and setting them up on the ground, while the helicopters were on a mission. In less than an hour, a flat and grassy field near Camp Holloway was transformed into a tent city. Water tanks called Lister bags stood on tripods. The tent canteen was almost assembled, and while soldiers stacked containers of dry rations on the sides of the tent, cooks were preparing dinner. While this whole process was going on, I hung around and made sure that the company's luggage was distributed to the correct tents. Then I was alone with my thoughts. I sat alone on a bunk in a damp general-purpose tent and took coffee and cigarettes. I was torn by conflicting feelings. The Bobsy bastards were the only pilots on the ground besides me, and that only added to the misery. When I heard the first sounds of returning helicopters, I jumped outside and watched. The Hueys were slipping out of the fog and gathering in the field west of the camp with increasing noise. One by one the Hueys came in for a landing. Spinning blades, swaying fuselages, and flying fog intertwined in a devious dance. The deafening roar of the turbines was interrupted, and the blades swayed lazily as the helicopters killed their engines. The crews wandered toward the camp. There were no casualties. I felt like an abandoned child who had met a family. Soon the tent was alive with conversation. "Hey Nate, you cut me off again, Al." "Fuck you, Connors. You better watch your flight and keep your distance." Jesus Christ. I don't know who's worse, you or the Kong. I was glad to hear them. 10 days on the ground seemed like an eternity. Our battalion spent 2 more days at Turkey Farm before packing up north toward Kontum. Once again I rode in a convoy. We found old French barracks that the Vietnamese had turned into stables and chicken coops. After doing a major cleanup, we set up camp there. I showed myself to the doctor every morning, and every morning he prescribed pills, forbidding me to fly. Finally, after 2 days in Kontum, I was cleared to fly. Riker and I were put on a joint flight. I didn't walk to the parking lot, but literally floated in the air with happiness. My job had become my home, and I was glad to be back. The helicopters seemed like ghosts in the early morning haze. We took off one by one to reunite above the fog. As we rose above the blurry silhouettes of trees, we lost sight of the ground. Riker, who knew where to fly, commanded us to turn left. Immediately after the maneuver, we saw the silhouette of a Huey flying toward us. I grabbed the controls and tilted back, but that wasn't what saved us from a mid-air collision. It was just luck. We had supplies to deliver to the recon teams. We followed the other 3 helicopters for about 30 miles on their way to Dak 2, then separated and headed west toward one of the groups. We shut down the vehicle, and the grunts started pulling out insulated containers of hot food. A sergeant approached us and invited us to have breakfast with the soldiers. We didn't bother to decline. Hot reconstituted scrambled eggs, bacon, white bread toast, and coffee. We sat on the floor of the Huey and ate in silence. The fog had already begun to clear, and the dark silhouettes around us exposed themselves, increasing in size and turning into mountains. The platoon commander, a skinny second lieutenant, came over to chat with us. "What did you find?" Ressler asked. "A couple of old campsites." The lieutenant patted his jacket for cigarettes. I handed him a Pall Mall. "Thank you." "They say the Viet Cong don't want to fight the cavalry." "Well, they're understandable," said the lieutenant. "We give them a hard time every time." "That's why we have helicopters, Phantoms and B-52 bombers," I thought. I said out loud, I hope the war ends soon. I hope so. Everyone around here is talking about peace talks. Johnson caught them in a net up north, and we're spitting them out here. Maybe they'll finally realize they can't win. Yeah, Riker agreed. I don't know how those little bastards are still hanging on. McNamara says we can be out of here in less than a year. They say we won't even get to serve our whole term. It'll be over so fast. Maybe so, the lieutenant said. At least we've definitely captured Dak To. There's a guy in our company, Wendell's name, and he says they've done it with the French before. I said. Done what? The lieutenant asked. Make them believe they're winning, set up camps and other encampments, and then bam. It's a different war now, said the lieutenant, tossing a steer onto the dew-damp ground. The French couldn't walk around as freely as we did. He patted the Huey on the floor. These swallows decide everything. I wouldn't want to guerrilla against an army that could be anywhere at any time. Yeah, I'll give you that, I agreed. And Wendell's a blabbermouth too. I guess so, answered the lieutenant. Yeah, said Riker. I already have plans. Get home early, get laid, and then unpack my suitcase. All right, I'm going to get back to work. Good luck, the lieutenant smiled and headed toward his soldiers. Phillips, send the guys to load the empty containers into the Huey. What's next? I asked Riker. We need to get back, dump this shit, and take some refugees somewhere. Black pajamas, conical hats, tied piglets in baskets, chickens turned upside down and necks up, wide-eyed children, crying babies, rolled rice mats, piles of firewood, and battered metal-lined crates that held on by their word of honor were loaded into the Huey. It's a panopticon, Riker grumbled. A piglet squealed at the howl of the turbine. I turned around and saw a young mother looking at us with saucer-round eyes as the baby suckled. I nodded and smiled at her. She nodded quickly and smiled back. God, they're scared to death, I thought. How would I feel if strangers had stuffed me and my whole family into a trick machine and airlifted me from my home to who knows where? They're on us now, I said. Don't bullshit me, Riker replied. We flew north, past Dak To and the junction of the Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese borders. I had never seen mountains so high. Smoky clouds lay like a blanket on a wet green bed. We flew in our position in a formation of 10 vehicles, keeping above the valleys to stay out of the clouds. As we passed a dark mountain whose peak was lost in whiteness, we saw a fresh landing strip of red earth beneath us. New shacks with tin roofs were defensively concentrated behind walls of sandbags with barbed wire running over the top. Welcome home, I thought. All eyes from the cargo hold stared intensely at the red earth as the helicopter formation floated out of the haze. Petite Republic of Vietnam Army soldiers with rifles on their belts ordered the refugees to climb out. A terrified mother looked back at her 2 children still inside. A soldier scooped up a piglet and tossed it into a communal pile intercepted by ropes. The squeal of the pig dissolved into the whistle of our blades. It twitched in the pile like a living sausage. One of the children was screaming and crying. The distraught mother quickly yanked him off the floor of the cargo hold and sat him on her lap. He clung tightly to her sweater, and she ran to her belongings, ducking under our blades. I watched her go. Her figure shrank as we gained altitude. Soon she was just a fidgety and frightened memory, all alone far from home. At that moment I hated communists and was ashamed to be an American. Then again, I had always been accused of being overly sensitive. All the next day we continued to move refugees. We were supposed to finish clearing this part of the Ya Drang Valley and head home to the Gulf area. However, by sunset we were dropping off the last group of people at one of the new villages. The commander decided to spend the night right there and move back out in the morning. 20 vehicles camped at dusk on a grassy summit. The summit served as a temporary camp for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. 2 huge tents had been set up for us. Riker and I brought our sleeping gear there and inflated our mattresses in the light of Army flashlights. There were dry rations for dinner, which we took up in the helicopter. Riker and Ressler sat on the floor of the cargo bay and ate out of cans while I twirled a can opener around a can of chicken. I was peeling the chicken meat off the jagged lid when suddenly the silence broke. A plop. And then a ringing sound. The ringing was ear-splitting. No one bothered to report the obvious mortars. The cans clattered to the floor, and the shadows scattered. I dropped the can and raced toward the narrow trench I'd recognized when I'd landed. It was only 20 feet away. Boom. I saw a bright flash from a shell that exploded 100 feet away from me. Ducking into the grass, I crawled the rest of the way to the trench. The trench was already occupied by 2 men from the helicopter crew that was in front of us. Boom. God damn it. Where do I run to? Boom. Holy shit. That was close. I jumped up and ran back to the chopper. The helicopter was my safety net. It always came to my rescue in times of need. Boom. My shadows slid across the dark lettering of the US Army on the tailbeam. I plummeted down and rolled under the belly of the car. My shoulder caught the fuel drain cock and nearly ripped it out with a pulp. My mind was long gone, and I crawled blindly toward the front of the helicopter, away from the fuel tank. Boom. I reached the crossbar and stopped. God damn it! I yelled. You bastards! Then it came to me that the Huey was nothing but thin aluminum, magnesium, plexiglass, and fuel, and that a direct hit could turn me to ash along with the entire structure. Get out of here, you stupid piece of shit. I yelled to myself. I crawled through the grass about a foot high, bumping my nose into the damp earth like it was a rail, and my head was a cart. After 10 feet I stopped. Boom. Hit a little to the right. No helmet. No weapon. I cursed my stupidity and swallowed tears. Silence. A bug crawled up my cheek. I heard a muffled spit and clang. A flare lit up the sky and hovered in the air. Spit chop, spit chop, spit chop. The shadows from the Huey intertwined with each other and raced frantically across the grass. The rocket faded and disappeared from sight, falling behind a mountain ridge. Grey smoke stretched in lazy streaks in the light of the rockets glinting above. Silence. Had they finished? After lying in the grass for another 10 minutes, I heard voices. That's it. It's over. God, how lucky we are. I got up. My shoulder hurt where I had hit the faucet. I believed in God. I did. I walked back to the helicopter, knelt down and began fumbling around in the grass looking for an already opened can of chicken meat. The fog was so thick I could barely see the Huey from the tent. The mountains that were still visible in the distance yesterday had completely disappeared. Resler was up early, and I could see a friendly tongue of orange flame over his burner. I shook myself up. It had been a cool and sleepless night. No one had been hurt in the shelling. No one could understand why the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army or whoever had stopped shelling so abruptly. We hadn't even launched any counterattacks. Most likely they just ran out of ammunition. Thank God for the meagre equipment of the Viet Cong. We were an easy target. Need a torch? Resler smiled as he squatted down. He scooped sugar out of a paper bag. The coffee exuded the flavor of life. Yeah, thanks. I bent inward over the cargo bay door and pulled a box of dry rations toward me. Let me guess. Scrambled eggs and bacon? Naturally. We're having breakfast. I think you're the only one in the company that eats that shit. That's fine, I'll get more of it. I took a can and a bag of coffee out of the box, poured some water into the cookie jar Resler had given me and put it on the burner. While the flames dried the surface of the can, I opened my omelette. Inside lay the familiar yellowish-green egg scrap with little bits of brownish bacon. I ate it cold. Resler made a squeamish face when I mewled. I picked up another piece with my spoon and held it out to him. You want some? I don't eat vomit. He grimaced. We repeated this dialogue often. It was our morning ritual. I'd never seen such dense fog. Yeah, he glanced at his watch. It's 7 o'clock, and it feels like 5 more. I nodded. The Huey in front of us looked like a pale ghost, and the car I knew was in front of it was completely hidden in the fog. On the instruments? Let's see. When was the last time you took off on instruments? And in flight school. Here I am. Faris emerged from the fog, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Just got off the phone with an Air Force pilot. Our valley is foggy, but it's clear near the peaks. We nodded. Duh. We'll wait another hour, maybe it'll stretch out. He moved on and disappeared. Where were you hiding last night? I asked. Over there, Resler pointed toward the tent. In the tent. Nope. See that ditch over there? Her. Look, if they hadn't stopped. I know. Someday they won't. An hour later, Faris ordered the stuff into the chopper. He and Riker were going to take off with a couple other vehicles, and he wanted us to listen in on the comms. He had to report how high the fog had gotten. As I followed Resler down the slope, dragging my flight bag, I veered to the left, no big deal, except that I was trying to go straight. I leaned to the right to change course, but I kept going left. I didn't feel dizzy, which was very strange. I stood for a minute and moved forward again. I felt myself start to get pulled off the road again, but I didn't pay any attention to it. When I reached the helicopter, the strange feeling was gone. I shook my head. It felt like I was falling apart. I buckled my seatbelt while Resler looked for the channel where Faris was supposed to be broadcasting. We listened as he named the helicopters that were to go with him. He asked if everyone was hooked into the channel. Roger, that Gary replied. The 6 helicopters that sat waiting responded one by one. We're in no hurry, Faris said. We're going back to Quantum for the infantry. You guys can join us anywhere over the valley where we flew yesterday. We'll be back in about an hour. We took turns confirming. While Faris was talking, I noticed something odd with my side vision. 10 feet away, to the right of the helicopter, there was a grey mortar shell sticking out in the grass. I shoved Gary. He followed my finger and nodded. His eyebrows rose up in surprise. I wish I was dead. It's not as bad as it looks, Faris continued. The fog ends at 500 or 600 feet. The main thing is to keep heading west during takeoff. Remember, there are mountains on the sides. Roger, that Gary replied. Yellow 1, we see a stuck mortar shell near us. What do you mean? There's a mortar shell from yesterday's shelling right next to our vehicle. Roger that. Call the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They should have a bomb squad. I lit a cigarette and stared at the shell. It was sticking out about where I'd been lying last night. Gary called the liaison officer, an American who was stationed with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Roger that, we'll take care of it. Don't try to touch it yourself. We both laughed. Good thing he warned me, I said. I was about to disarm it. When we were brave enough, the crews of the 7 helicopters began to report for takeoff, and we could hear them moving off into the fog. Gary and I decided that, since the shell hadn't worked before, it wouldn't work now, so we waited. Neither of the 2 of us felt confident enough to take off on instruments. We still had plenty of time. We could wait. The last helicopter took off. They reported that the fog was still up to 500 or 600 feet. I guess so. Shall we try it? Yeah, I looked at the mortar shell. Get the fuck out of here. I looked at the shell while Gary started up. Can it react to our blades when they start flapping through the air? Even if it could, I wouldn't know about it. The Republic of Vietnam Army has top-notch bombers. Are they here yet? No. Oh, you mean like that? Yeah, first rate. Gary's lowered the artificial horizon for takeoff. Okay, Bob, you watch the takeoff too. Sure. Joe, is everyone on board? Affirmative, the flight engineer replied. Sir, are you sure you don't want to wait a little longer? Relax, Sergeant. We know how to fly this thing. Copy that. Looks like we didn't convince him. Gary looked at me and smiled. I nodded. As he added power, I looked at the projectile. The grass around it was buckling under the airflow from the blades. Did it just swing? The helicopter lifted off the ground. The shell disappeared from view along with everything else. There was no sense of motion. The artificial horizon was exactly where it needed to be, and the airspeed was building. Gary let it diverge to 40 knots and began to hold that value. The turn and roll turn went perfectly. Arrow, balloon, airspeed. That's the slogan we memorized in flight school. I checked the instruments in that order. Gary was going perfectly. The white void stretched out in all directions. The helicopter hummed, the instruments showed we were moving, but by feel it felt like we were stuck in place in a strange vacuum. You've gotten 2 A's so far, I said, referring to the flight rating system on the checklists our instructors carried with them. Don't screw it up. Like 2 fingers, Gary replied. The whiteness was getting brighter. It was already shining. If it weren't for the cockpit landmark, I could have sworn I was blind. The bright white took on a blue tint, and we could see a dark green peak to our right. Hurrah, I said approvingly. Top flight, sir. The flight engineer believed. I looked down. The smoky sea below us concealed the valley where the midnight shells were hurtling. The tops of the mountains looked like shining islands. I shivered with relief and smiled. It had been a rough night, but there was clear sky ahead. Riker and I sat in the outboard seat of the Fairchild, which was buzzing towards Saigon. I threw my feet up on the flight bag that held absolutely all of my belongings. I was flying away for good. Riker had a connecting flight ahead to Hong Kong. He was on vacation. I had volunteered for the transfer, and it was beyond me why I was already pining for the cavalry. Did you see Ressler break 881? Riker asked. Not Ressler, the rookie. Yeah, but Ressler's car. I'd said goodbye to Gary a little earlier, catching him on his way to the airplane parking lot where he was headed with Swain, the rookie. Gary was going to test his flying skills. Maybe I won't see you again, Gary said. Maybe not. Not if I see you first. He laughed. Yeah. Well, it was fun, even though we liked to argue. That's okay. I was always right anyway. He smiled and held out his hand. I'm going to give the new kid a good run for his money. I've got your home address. I'll write when we've served our time. We shook hands. Be sure to write. Don't get lost. I nodded and loosened my handshake. See you soon. He smiled and headed for the helicopters. See you soon. I watched him follow. I decided to watch him take off, so I sat down on the sandbags near the tent. Where are they sending you, Mason? Captain Owens stepped out and pushed his cap to the back of his head. A place called Phan Rang, 49th Air Company. Owens nodded. I've never heard of them. Neither have I, but they're not part of the cavalry. Gary and Swain climbed into the car, license plate 881, the oldest Huey in the company. Huh, they don't exactly belong, Owens smirked. There's only one cavalry. Gary's helicopter started up, and I got to my feet. Good luck with your new company, Owens said. Thank you. They shifted into hover and started to move out of the parking lot when suddenly the madness began. The machine tumbled on its back over the tail, the propellers thundered to the ground, the tail shaft flew off to the side, the fuselage crashed down. Helicopter parts flew everywhere. Oh my God! I shouted and rushed toward them down the path. The mangled fuselage lay on the roof. I saw the flight mechanic climbing out of the wreckage, pale and dazed-eyed. I had a bad feeling I had already imagined Ressler in as bad a state as his car. But then I saw him squeezing through the twisted metal. He was terrified, but he was smiling. Are you okay? I yelled. Gary shook himself off and started laughing. Swain wandered around in circles nearby. The flight mechanic was on his knees trying to get the machine gunner out of the door. Puddles of fuel were already gathering around him. Come on, yelled the flight mechanic, struggling as hard as he could. Fried, the gunner, was bleeding from a deep wound on his temple. Gary wandered silently toward the headquarters tent, then stopped and walked back to the crash site. "Are you okay?" I ran up to him. "Of course I am," he laughed. "Of course I'm okay. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? Look at the car." He laughed again, a smile that didn't go with his pale and confused face. Hard landing. The machine gunner was helped to the tent hospital. He was the only one injured. I exhaled. A hard landing is when you can't get out of the helicopter by yourself. What happened? Gary's question gave me a fit of laughter. "You don't know." Holy shit, the last thing I remember was buckling my seatbelt. And then bam. Swain was driving? I didn't think he could fuck up a parking lot exit. "Hey Mason, we gotta go. The jeep to the airfield is here," Riker yelled from the tent. "Shit. All right, I gotta go. You sure you're okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." "What's the big deal?" Riker was going through his bag. The buzzing of the cargo plane was starting to make me drowsy. "Look, Riker, every time I have to go to Saigon, you're there. And that means you're a lucky asshole. I'm going to have to get a room for the night. My plane doesn't leave till tomorrow. How about we split the room?" "I'd like that. My new company doesn't expect me in 2 days," I said. I looked out the porthole across the cargo hold and noticed that the plane was tilting badly. It looked like we were on approach. Then we hit some turbulence. It reminded me of the air parade for the general. 2 days in a row we practiced and the weather was just perfect. A convoy of Hueys, Chinooks, Caribou, Mohawks, and even a few small H-13s stretched out for 2 miles, linking and Key Pass and the Gulf area. "Hold tight," the colonel commanded. We followed his order. Ressler flew co-pilot, and I was in control because in our formation position I was closer to the car we were following. "Look, you don't have to press in so hard," Ressler said. "These guys know their stuff," I said, referring to Connors and Banjo, who were flying in front of us. "You can go blade to blade with them." Fucking extreme. I grinned at that title and flew even closer. "I knew not to open my mouth," Gary commented. I moved the blade tips so close that there was no more than 3 feet between us and the next car. I kept a 3-foot height margin in case of wind gusts and possible drift. "You ever been in the open?" "No, I don't plan to." Continuing to maintain a 3-foot headroom, I moved smoothly forward. With my left hand, I pulled the general pitch lever up and down, keeping our blades above Connor's and Banjo's. Banjo was watching. He grinned just a few feet away from us, showing a raised thumbs up. Then he waved for me to fly even closer. The grin on his face communicated that this was a challenge. "All right, formation, look good. Keep as wide as you can in the turns. Don't bunch up. Not in the turns, Mason." I nodded. All I could see was the height margin between our blades. The rest of the world didn't exist to me. As their car bounced on the air pocket, my hand jerked us upward at the same moment. I knew I could keep my distance and cover their blades with mine. I slowly pulled myself up as the turn began. "That's it. That's it. You did it." "Let's go back," Gary pleaded. Connors knew what I had in mind, so he flew like silk. We did the whole turn with the blades on the inside, 2 or 3 feet apart. When we came out of the turn, I flew away from them and exhaled. "Do you really enjoy suffering through shit like that?" Gary asked in disgust. "Why are you smiling?" Riker returned me to the Fairchild's cargo hold. "Nothing. Just remembering our parade. Fucking waste of time, not a parade." "Yeah," I agreed. But my thoughts had already turned to the flight we'd recently taken to Bong Sun. When we returned from combing the Dak to neighborhood, the company was sent to Bong Sun to support the 227th. The Viet Cong were retaking the valley we had captured 2 months earlier. During the briefing at the range, the officer in charge said, Check your gas masks. We will be using CS. And tear gas. The crowd roared. Gas masks? What gas masks? Outside, the commander took a quick inventory and found that we had enough gas masks for exactly half the squad. One of the pilots and one of the gunners in each vehicle would have to go without gas masks. Can't we go back and get more? No time, the commander replied. Resler and I and 2 members of our crew stood by the car, looking at the 2 gas masks. Resler pulled out a coin. The flight mechanic and the gunner flipped. The flight mechanic won. Heads or tails? Resler smiled confidently. He'd never lost. Heads. He tossed. Heads. As it turned out, the gas had almost dissipated in our landing zone, and we only took 1 bullet as we flew away. But I remembered Resler sitting in his chair, grimacing, wiping away tears, and yelling over the intercom. "Fuck you! God damn it!" The airplane tilted hard. Through the window I could see the outskirts of a large city. Just in time, Riker said. "I see you enjoyed your flight," smiled the whole way. I did. Very much so. I'm just happy to be out of the cavalry. Ha. When you're in your new company, we'll see. We were to stay at a hotel someone recommended to Riker. I don't remember what it was called or where it was. Part of the reason for that was that we had had an excellent dinner and many drinks that night before we got there. There was a narrow lobby and ceilings 12 feet high. The hotel itself looked dark and dubious, and the receptionist checked us in indifferently. The feeling was that the Vietnamese were already used to us and were not thrilled with us. We were given a key and pointed toward a dark hallway. What a hole, Riker. And my comrade highly recommended it. Huge rooms, low prices. The windowless room had 2 beds, a chest of drawers, and a small wooden table. There was a window above the tall doorway that occupied one corner. I plopped down on the bed with an issue of Time magazine. Riker had changed into shorts and was writing something while sitting at the desk. The article was about the transfer of General Kinnard, for whom we were having a parade. "Hey," I exclaimed, "it says so much about Kinnard's transfer and not a word about mine." After the parade, I flew to the river to wash the car. As usual, we sat with Long on the sandbar and talked. "It's too bad you're leaving," she said. Her English improved with each meeting. She was a self-taught genius. "I'll miss you too. Will you give your wife a present from me?" "Of course, but you shouldn't give me gifts." "Not you." She giggled. "Your wife." She took off her gold wire earrings and held them out to me. "No," I shook my head. "You can't just give away your earrings, Long. I'm the rich man here. I'll pay you for them." I reached into my pocket. A look of resentment showed on her face. She was really trying to make me feel good. Okay, no money. I'll give it to Patience." She smiled broadly and handed me the gift. I wrapped the earrings in a piece of notebook paper and put them in the breast pocket of my shirt. "Thank you for the gift. Patience will really like them." She smiled. I patted the breast pocket. "They're still there. I should mail them out as soon as I get to the new location." I wasn't reading anymore, just looking at the letters, so I put the magazine aside. Riker had already settled down. My grandfather's Hamiltons were reporting that it was 11 o'clock. Someone knocked on the door. "Yes," I shouted. No answer. Another knock. Who the hell else has come? I got up. Maybe the maid. I walked to the door. Maybe if it was the maid, why was I afraid to open the door? I've lost my mind, I thought. As I turned the round knob, the door swung inward, slammed into my shoes, and stopped. I instinctively pulled it further and ended up face to face with a scowling Asian man who was only a couple inches shorter than me. "Hey." I pushed on the door, trying to slam it shut. My foot started sliding backwards, the door opening wider and wider. I piled my whole body on top of it and saw that there were 4 or 5 people pressing on the door from the outside. Silently. With bad intentions. "Hey, Riker, get over here. There's a bunch of gooks trying to break in." Riker froze for a second, but then he realized I was serious. "What the hell?" He ran up. My foot pulled further away. I could squeeze through the gap. "Come on, motherfucker! Come on!" I yelled. My foot, stuck under the door, was the only thing keeping the guests from entering the room. Riker piled on, backing the door and resting his feet on the foot of my bed. The gap in the opening narrowed a little, and I slid my foot forward. The guests struck with a rush, and I thought my fingers were going to crack from the pressure. Hands showed through the gap, grabbing the air, trying to reach us. Lurching and heavy breathing were the only sounds around us. Riker and I were already dousing ourselves with sweat. The heavy door groaned and cracked, but the gap was slowly getting smaller. It was hard to believe, but we were winning. Someone's hand grabbed the door jamb as we were getting ready to slam it shut. I punched the hand with my fist. It didn't help. I started pounding on the hand until it unclenched and slid back through the gap. Barely had my fingers slipped off the jamb, and the door slammed shut. With shaky, awkward, wet fingers, we slid the lock shut and threw on the extra hook. Riker and I looked at each other in bewilderment. Are we having the same nightmare? Suddenly we heard the thud of a body breaking through the door, and the door began to sag inward. The muffled thuds began to rhythmically repeat like the heavy pounding of a heart. "Call the fucking receptionist." Riker woke up. I rushed to the night table and picked up the phone. Riker was moving the dresser toward the door. The plywood crawled across the tile floor with a crack. I dialed the receptionist. "You're calling," yelled Riker, trying to block the banging door with the dresser. "Yeah, no answer." I wiped the sweat from my eyes. "Bitch, no answer." After 50 beeps, I realized they weren't going to answer. We sat down on the bed across from each other and watched the door, which shook with every bang. "Derringer, get the Derringer." Riker brightened at his idea. "I sold it to Hall." "Sold it to Hall. That was your revolver for the last fight, and it had just started." I nodded and shrugged my shoulders. "The revolver was sold to John Hall for $25. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard of." I nodded sorrowfully. Crunch. We jumped at the new sound. They started throwing something metal at the rectangular window. Crunch. Shards of glass flew inside. The window had a wire mesh built into it. In the very center of the window, where the glass had been, there was a hole the size of a fist. "Try the bell again," Riker said. I listened to the mechanical click of a switch, then a series of loud beeps, then another click and beep. Riker was taking the bed apart. Beneath the mattress were hardwood rungs. He tossed one of them onto my bed. Quite an impressive club. I shook my head as he looked at the phone. Then he hung up. "Bastards," Riker yelled. At 2:00 in the morning, the banging stopped. Riker had managed to fall asleep, proving that you can get used to anything. I sat leaning back against the pillow, holding my club in my lap. When the pounding stopped, I tried the phone one more time. There was another small window under the ceiling at the other end of the room. As I rang, glass shards flew from it. Riker jumped at the new sound. "What the hell is going on in here?" he pleaded. I didn't know. I'd been sitting on the bed for 2 hours, listening to the sounds of the cracking door and wondering the same thing. They're obviously trying to kill us. Why hadn't they blown the hell out of that door yet? Didn't go get an axe? Set it on fire? Didn't they think of something other than the fucking blows? Maybe let them inside and blast their heads off with clubs. A quick no flashed through my mind. I'd been brave in the helicopter chair while the others tried to kill me, but I was totally unprepared to fight on the cot bars with 5 angry Asians. I waited to see what they would do. The asshole receptionist would be back soon, hear the commotion, and call the police. There are police in Saigon, right? Maybe the neighbors will hear them. They'll go and get help. But the knocking continued. I wanted to scream at the absurdity of the situation. But I couldn't scream. I'm a soldier. That thought made me laugh out loud. Soldier Joe's about to calm a bunch of those dirty gooks down, I said. Then I imagined a sea of ways Soldier Joe could put down this mob. Of course, all the ways were based on the fact that Soldier Joe always had a spare gun. I gripped my club and waited. A flamethrower would be nice. The room was windowless, so dawn broke unnoticed. My watch told me it was 6 in the morning. The knocking had stopped. I woke Riker. We dragged the splinter-covered dresser to the side and cautiously opened the door. There was some trash lying around outside, but there were no people. We quickly gathered our things and stepped out into the hallway. Clear. As we approached the counter, we nearly had heart attacks when we saw the receptionist staring at us. "Bitch, where were you last night?" we yelled. "Sir, I don't work nights." "TU works nights." "Where was he?" I asked. "He has been sitting here all night, sir. He was definitely here this morning when I got here." "Bullshit," I yelled. The receptionist twitched a little but asked, "Is there something wrong with your room?" "Some people have been breaking into our room all night, asshole," Riker replied. "What are you?" "Strange," said the administrator. "Did you call the desk?" "Yes. All night," I said. "Maybe the phone was broken." "Even if it was broken," I began, "our room is at most 50 feet away. You couldn't help but hear the noise." "I'll let the manager know," the receptionist replied. He looked at us quietly. It was obvious in his eyes that he knew what had happened last night, and that we could yell and scream and complain until Judgment Day. He wasn't going to admit to anything. We grabbed our bags and left. Phan Rang is by the sea, about 160 miles south of Quin Hong and 160 miles northeast of Saigon, but I didn't go there right away. First I checked in at the 12th Aviation Battalion camp near Nha Trang. Then I sat in a bar in a village at sea level and chatted with a drunk, depressed and yellowed mechanic who worked for one of the many American companies in Vietnam. "I'm sick of being stuck here," he said. "Why don't you go home?" The pay is so good he greedily downed the rest of his beer. "And you can't find wet girls like here back home. I got a bitch waiting for me back home." "You bet she is. Only a bitch could stand Mr. Gloom, and the only place on earth where he could get a wet slut was the country where he'd become a rich American mechanic." I nodded silently. He told me about his job, his housing, his madam, his stereo, his growing bank account. I nearly fainted with boredom. Hearing the noise of engines, I retreated. The mechanic nodded vaguely and turned his booth toward the bartender. He tapped his mug on the bar and pointed menacingly at IT. "Say that again," he said. The Huey landed on the sandy patch of ground where I'd expected it. The flight mechanic ran past me with a bag of letters for the battalion base. I threw my gear aboard and pulled on my flight helmet. "Are you Mason?" the pilot asked. I nodded. "Ah. Good, we'll wait for him and take off." He pointed to the departing mechanic. I climbed into the Huey, which was in low gear, and smoked. It was good to be back in a helicopter after the jolt of the cargo planes. The mechanic returned and the pilot took off, kicking up a sandstorm. We flew forward and the oncoming breeze felt pleasantly cold on our skin. Cam Ranh Bay was halfway to my new company. As we flew past, I watched the rows of naval patrol bombers bobbing by the pier. For the rest of the flight, I dreamed of my own seaplane, that I could fly cargo around the Bahamas or tourists around the lakes of Canada. When I saw the concrete buildings at Phan Rang Air Force Base, I felt a surge of happiness. At last I would live like a human being. But the Huey proceeded past the barracks and landed in a grassy field about a mile from the runway. I saw the familiar rows of sagging, mud-covered general-purpose tents and immediately recognized my new home. The sun was glowing red in the west, and the ground underfoot was very damp. We hobbled across the field and threw our flak jackets into the tent. The two pilots, Deacon and Red, took me to the officer's house. "Well, well." The major smiled welcomingly. the second cavalry pilot in 2 days. Tall, dark-haired, with a smooth-shaven face, he walked over and shook my hand. "Welcome to the Prospectors. I'm the company commander, and you'll soon find out that the boys call me Ring by sight." About 15 guys laughed, sitting at tables in a bar with bamboo walls and a tin roof. I nodded nervously, bumping into such a friendly commander for the first time in my life. "Nice to meet you," I said. "You look me straight in the eye when you talk." "That's good. That means you're not afraid." He turned to the boys. "That's good," he repeated. They nodded. I wasn't afraid, but I was wary. What did he want from me? First things first, Thimble began. "Red, take Mason to the tent. Give him an empty bunk." I headed for the door behind Red. "When you've unpacked, come back. Dinner will be in about half an hour, and we'll talk then." "Yes, sir." He glowed. There was red dust rolling over the floor, but there was a plywood platform next to my bunk. I sat down on the bunk, which was already tucked in, and looked around. Red was smiling at me from his bunk. God, they don't even have a floor, I thought. "Why do they call him the Ring?" I asked. "He's a West Point graduate. They give them rings for graduation." "Oh, wow." I'd never met a West Point graduate before. Now his aggressively friendly demeanor seemed understandable. Seemed like a nice guy. He is. Much better than our last commanding officer. Nobody liked that asshole. That's why he woke up one day with a knife sticking out of his chest. Red talked about it like they had to deal with incompetent commanders all the time. Are you kidding? No. He was black and a total asshole. We still don't know who stabbed him. Did he die? No, we got into Camran in time. Strangely enough, it all turned out well. They put Ring in his place, and he's a natural leader, you know. I've never met a natural-born commander, but I understood what he meant anyway. The officer's house I had time to visit was in one part of a tin-roofed building. In the second part was the mess hall. Dinner was served by Vietnamese waitresses, and 4 men sat at each table with cloth tablecloths, clean napkins, and metal cutlery. Over the meal, Red explained to me that it was all paid for with officer dues and food stamps. Don't get too used to it, we don't come here much. No sooner had we finished eating than I heard the sounds of a guitar coming from the officer's house on the other side of the bamboo wall. The building shook as the Phantom IF-4 turned on the afterburner for takeoff. Yes, this was an airbase. The airstrip was a quarter-mile from the prospectors' camp. The prospectors themselves were a small gang of gypsies who occupied a vacant corner within the walls of this town. When Red and I walked in, there was a howl from someone's voice in the officer's house. Military pilots singing this song. The Viet Cong is about to crack. The airborne infantry are sailing through the sky. We're setting traps. We're on the hunt. Man. This is a nightmare, said Ring. We can change it. It's just a sketch, replied the singer, a captain named Daring. Hey, Daring, flush your ditties down the toilet, asshole, yelled from the bar a rosy-cheeked cherub. It was Captain King, also known as the King of the Sky. All right, damn you, Daring stared angrily at the King of Heaven. Let's hear your side of the story. Chop, chop, chop Nancy between the legs, that's my version. Yes, Nancy? Nancy, a Vietnamese girl in her early 20s, had special permission to work at the bar until 8 o'clock at night. All other Vietnamese staff were kicked out before dark. No! You're bad. She blushed. As I was told, Nancy never indulged in the lewd advances of the King of Heaven, nor did she indulge in the advances of anyone else. She was beautiful, slender, and smart, the perfect bartender. She told anyone who wanted to hit on her that she had a husband. Hey, Mason Ring straightened up at his table when he saw me. Recognize your comrade? He pointed to the heavy-set man sitting next to him. No, sir, I don't, I said. The Ring beckoned me to them. This is Mr. Cannon of. He looked at Cannon. Delta Company, 227th Cannon announced. Neighbours, I said. Nice to meet you. Cannon nodded worriedly. Super. Cannon flew combat chopper in the cavalry thimble began. But in our company, we only allow skinny pilots to fly combat choppers. You know, the B models are very flimsy, especially when loaded with ammunition. That's why all our chopper pilots are skinny assholes, just like you. I feel like I've been electrocuted. That's why Cannon's so tense. The Ring was going to put him in the slick, and he was going to put me in a war chopper. What's wrong? Ring asked, seeing the look on my face. I fly slicks. Yeah, and I fly combat, Cannon interjected. Ring frowned. I have a principle, skinny on combat, fat on slicks, and I don't understand what you're so afraid of, Mason. It's a lot safer in combat than it is in slicks. Slicks take most of the bullets. At least you have something to shoot back with. The Phantom roared on takeoff. Daring was reprising the song, Infantry Sailing Through the Sky. I have 600 hours of combat flying time as a slick pilot. That's all my experience. And I'm still alive. I wouldn't want to change anything this late in the game. Likewise, Cannon said. I'm still alive, and I don't want to change anything. 600 hours? Ring was impressed. Exactly. Shit, he said. The most experienced men in our company have flown 300 hours, even Deacon. Ring tapped his ring on the table. You live in the sky. Yeah, and I know how to fly slicks. And I know how to fly combat, Cannon added. God damn it. Ring looked dejected. I have a principle, actually. Cannon, badly out of sorts, leaned back in his chair. Another fan of the fucking charter, I thought. All right, all right. All right, to hell with you, said Ring. Fuck my principles. Cannon, you fly combat. Mason, you fly slick. Ring smiled. That's an order? Yes, sir, I said. It's a deal, Cannon said. Setting traps, going hunting, Daring muttered. No, Daring suddenly broke into the circle of composers. Nightmare, nightmare, nightmare. The King of Heaven collapsed to his knees and clasped his ears with his palms. I'm going to vomit, he shouted. He hunched over and made gagging sounds. Listen up. We'll write a good song and go to Saigon for a 2-day concert, announced Ring. Don't you want to fuck in Saigon for a couple days? I was stunned as I listened to Ring's speech. Concert? A song contest. Cannon, who was sitting with his arms crossed over his chest, looked at me and shook his head. These guys are weird. The composers argued, then Daring struck the strings again. This time, 3 of the 20 or so people were singing along. As they sang, I noticed some movement near the wall. A human skull nailed above the bar moved its jaw, clacking to the beat. The King of Heaven was tugging on a fishing line that stretched from the skull to the far side of the bar. Dash louder. Charlie, he yelled. Charlie? I asked Red. Yeah, Doc made him out of a Viet Cong head we brought back with us. Well, what else would you call a Viet Cong head? The song's over. Shit, Deacon said. Really? Ring asked worriedly. Deacon was one of the platoon leaders in the prospectors. He was also an instructor pilot and company sage. He had a greying hedgehog and a smooth-shaven earnest face. Ring trusted him wholeheartedly. Yes, Deacon answered. Welthing shook his head. We'll keep trying. The prospectors left at dawn. I stayed in camp with another warrant named Stagliani. We were to fly the Slick, which was under repair at the time. Stagliani explained to me that 5 of the company's helicopters had already gone into position at Enon Co. It's routine. We send some of the guys ahead so they have time to set up camp, and the rest come back and rest. Stagliani was tall, swarthy, and had a quiet voice. He had a New York accent. Flatbush. It's in Brooklyn, he explained. So what, we're just supposed to sit around and wait for the car to be fixed? That's right. The mechanic said it would be ready by tomorrow morning. We watched a squadron of 4 Phantoms take off. When they turned on the afterburner during the climb, it sounded like thunder. They're having fun, I said. They sure are, Staglioni said. I've tried it. You've flown the Phantom? Yeah, you can, too, if you want to. They're always coming by. They offer to swap flights. They want to fly the Huey? Aha. Aha. They like to prove they can hover the first time. I bet they can't. And you'd be right. So far they've never made it. One of the pilots even flew a mission with us once. Spit up afterward. He thought we were getting too close, in the middle of it, you know. They can't see anything from their cockpits. They aim for the smoke in the jungle, drop their shit, and they're on their way back. From takeoff to landing, they're only in the air for an hour or so. Slackers. It's like this every day. 100 sorties and you can go home. He was quiet for a minute as the Phantom came in for a landing. How's that? 100 flights. Hell, I could have gone home twice already. You guys are counting flights? Well, unofficially. I keep my own account. I recently told a guy in the Air Force about how many sorties I've flown. And he said to me, "What did you want? The smartest pilots are in the Air Force." Bastard. I watched another Phantom take off. If I'd stayed in school, I mentally lamented I'd be flying these things and living on the other side of the runway. That's right, I said. What? The smartest pilots really are in the Air Force. The campground turned into a ghost town of dirty tarps. The path wiggling from the officer's house between rows of 10 general-purpose tents was completely overgrown. Staglioni went to his tent. I went to mine. I wrote Patience a letter, sharing the latest news and giving her a new mailing address. A Vietnamese woman dressed in black pajamas slipped through the tent canopy. She nodded as she passed and proceeded to the opposite end of the tent, sweeping the dirt floor with a bamboo broom, leaving smooth parallel lines behind her in the dust. When she reached me, she bowed slightly and froze, waiting for me to lift my feet off the plywood platform. I put my feet up and she went through the broom from underneath. Then she started making the beds. There were 4 of them in the tent. When she got to me, she bowed again. Her smile was betel black. She was waiting for me to get up. I jumped up. "Oh," I uttered. "Ah," she said. She pulled all the linens off the bunk, made it new, and carefully arranged my things. Folded vest over here, holstered pistol on top like this. She stepped back, presented her artistic arrangement, and with a nod allowed me to lower my ass back onto the blanket. "Thank you," I said. She smiled with her black betel mouth and hurried outside. The army had gotten a swampy part of the field and a gloomy place to live, but Featherstone had decided to twist and add some comfort to ease the oppressive atmosphere. I wandered around the tent for a while, climbed out, watched the Phantom take off, and nodded to the Vietnamese maid as she passed by. I wanted to walk over to Staglioni to chat, but he was busy reading some interesting book. I remembered that I had a book, too. I was halfway through the 2nd volume of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Gollum was sliding down the cliffs, hastily chasing Bilbo. I sympathized with Gollum. I liked his voice. Das SS, he hissed. I tried to copy his speech to the cavalry. Das SS, we like missions, but the people around me couldn't understand why I'd suddenly started whispering. No one knew who Gollum was. The most popular books were the adventures of James Bond. As I was reading, my brain gave some sort of glitch. It was definitely a glitch, because the book suddenly flew to the dirty floor and I reached for my gun, repeating what instead of lying on my back and reading quietly. What I wandered around the tent, peering around corners. I looked outside. What? Something had gone wrong. I tensed up. I was ready. I waited. A dark head peeked through the canopy. I raised my gun and recognized Staglioni. "Dinner," he said, and walked away. He hadn't noticed the gun. Suddenly, the feeling of a fatal threat was gone. The danger had passed. What the danger was, I never realized, but it was over. I holstered the gun and headed for the dining room. I sat down at a table with Staglioni and 2 Air Force pilots who had stopped by for dinner. During the meal, I couldn't stop thinking about my prank. All was calm around me. It was about me. I was going crazy. "Would you like to give it a try?" The Air Force lieutenant asked. "Try what?" "Fly the Phantom." "I fly slicks." "I know you do. Shall we swap?" He looked at me questioningly. "No." The next day the Huey wasn't ready. Neither was the day after. While I waited, the weekdays followed the same schedule. Breakfast, book; lunch, book; dinner, book; sleep. This schedule was interspersed with bouts of incomprehensible terror. At night I would jump out of bed in search of the source of the fears. One night I passed out at a table in the officer's house. I was sitting reading a book when I suddenly realized I was lying with my face on the pages. This frightened me so much that I decided to pour out my tormented soul to the aviation doctor at Air Force Camp. I get dizzy. I wake up at night feeling like I'm going to die, and yesterday I fell face first into a book I admitted shamefully. "Take off your clothes," the doctor said with sympathetic concentration. "Does it have anything to do with the body? I'll check the nervous system." And he did. He poked me with needles, tickled my heels, tapped my elbows and knees, made me follow my fingers and flashlight with my eyes, stand on one leg, and touch the tip of my nose with my eyes closed. After one last look into my eyes with an ophthalmoscope, he pronounced, "Hemum." "Did you find anything?" I asked. "Nothing. Nothing at all. Your reflexes are perfectly normal." "Then why am I having these seizures and dizzy spells?" "I don't know." I cringed sadly. "I have a couple of suspicions," he added quickly. "You may have a rare form of epilepsy, but I doubt it. Or you could be suffering from stress. Given the nature of your job, it's probably stress. But I suggest you consult an aviation doctor, if possible. If your symptoms persist, you could be suspended from flying." 4 days into my new company, and a week after leaving the cavalry, I joined my new unit in a field near Henencourt. The prospectors' helicopters stood on a narrow flight line that the French had cut further into the jungle. The camp was on a hill near the strip. I gathered my gear and found Deacon, who escorted me to one of the 20 hexagonal tents scattered across the sandy, grassy dunes at the very top of the hill. My tent neighbours were 2 Warrens, Monk and Stoopy Stoddard. "Hey, new guy," Monk said. He was looking away from the magazine clippings he was stacking in a shoebox. He had a square chin and a strong, thick build. But he squinted against the light of the lamp behind me. "By the looks of it, you're not new to Nama." He was looking at my belt buckle. The green ribbon that ran over the buckle was almost black with dirt, the mark of a veteran. "It went like this. I was transferred out of the cavalry." "Really?" Stoddard wondered. "The cavalry. They're tough guys." Stoopy was like a fat kid, throwing around annoying words like gosh, wow, and even nice. I nodded and asked, "Can I throw my gear in here?" I pointed to the far side of the tent. "Sure." I threw my bag against the tarp wall and sat on top of it. Monk went back to the clippings. Shredded issues of Stars and Stripes, Newsweek, Time, and other magazines were lying around his bedroll on the dirt floor. He carefully cut out each article with a pair of Swiss Army knife scissors, then rustled cardboard cards with the letters of the alphabet to place the clipping in the right place. "What are you, a writer?" I asked. "Monk is a writer?" Stoopy laughed. His stomach and cheeks shook. I noticed the chocolate stains on his lips, and then I saw the bar he was clutching in his grimy paw. "Monk, he thinks you're a writer." He laughed loudly. Monk threw him a glare that instantly killed the laughter. Stoopy blinked and respectfully hushed him. "No, not yet," Monk replied. "For now, I'm gathering material." Someday. He stopped talking, as if avoiding a sore subject. I see you've already got quite a stockpile. I nodded at the box. Thanks, but that's not all. He pointed to the 4 rubber-banded boxes that stood against the canvas wall. Someday, you'd be surprised what people say about this war. He nodded slowly and meaningfully. I demonstrated agreement. Well, well, well. Who do we have here? Said a voice from behind the canopy. Wolf. Mason, it's been years. We both laughed. Wolf was a buddy of mine from flight school. I didn't know you were on the prospectors, I said. I'm one of the knuckleheads who built this camp. I missed your arrival. Well, you picked the right place. Thanks. Wolf's intrusion made Monk tense. He pulled the rubber band off his wrist, wrapped it around the box, and placed it carefully with the others. Then rose and silently squeezed past Wolf. Wolf paid him not the slightest attention. They seemed to be at odds. Wolf and I had a few words. He'd arrived in Vietnam a month ahead of me. He was very impressed that I had grown up to be a demob with only 2 months of service left. I told him that I had served in the cavalry and that I had recently met some other flight school comrades in Kontum. We gossiped about the fates of our classmates and concluded that most of the class appeared to have ended up in Nama. Someone called for dinner, and Stupy, whom we had completely ignored all this time, jumped outside. As we exited the tent, we spotted Monk, who was standing on his hands and trying to scale a small sand dune. Not bad, I said as we stepped back. He's a cretin, Wolf replied sourly. That night I showed the letter from the Air Force doctor to Doc D.D. Vinci, our aviation doctor. He agreed that it could very well be a stress reaction and gave me a sedative. He warned that it could only be taken at night. Flying under the pills was not allowed. I slept soundly that night. The next morning I was back in my saddle in the Huey seat. The crew commander was Deacon, my platoon leader. We did 3 arson junk runs around the neighborhood, flying a separate helicopter. Deacon trusted me completely with the controls. In 4 hours that morning I managed to land in an area so narrow I had to hover vertically down, land on a tiny peak, carry 2 loads so heavy I had to take off by airplane, and lastly join 3 other vehicles in a formation flight on the way back to the parking lot. I was given a thorough inspection. Damn good flying, Deacon said, as I put the Huey in the parking lot. Thanks, I replied. It was a valuable compliment coming from a pilot instructor. If you're as good tomorrow, I'll make you crew chief right away. The next day was the last day in Non-Co, so after finishing up with hauling ass and junk, we headed for Phan Rang. Other helicopters were carrying tents and gear. I flew well again, and Deacon kept his word by putting me in charge of the crew. As we walked back to the company, he told me that Ring was preparing another big party. We rarely get breaks like this. We're stuck here for 4 more days. Ring likes his soldiers to have a good time. If I were you, I'd keep a bedroll ready, Deacon said. Prepare a bedroll? Aha. Just roll up the mattress and tie it down. Why? You'll see. It was 9 p.m., and the party was in full swing. Doc Da Vinci was sitting next to me at the bar, explaining how he had prepared the skull that was now singing songs. Doc was drunk. All the composers had gathered in a circle in the far corner. They sat across from each other and were making noise, blaring a Joan Baez record. They were drunk. King Sky and Red Blakely had an Indian wrestling match right in the center of the room. King Sky held a beer mug filled to the brim and declared that he would take Red down without spilling a drop. I brewed it, Da Vinci said. In the dining room? I asked, interested. No one would allow it in the dining room. I built a fire in the back and boiled it over it. Boiled all day. I looked at the skull, clacking its jaw to Joan's singing, and marvelled at its pure, shining whiteness. It's so white. It's so white. It's not natural. I threw it in bleach when I scraped all the meat off. I took a sip of bourbon and nodded. Exactly. Bleach. That's right, Da Vinci replied. Clorox will make your skull look dazzling. Here we go, shouted the King of Heaven. Everyone fell silent. I heard a siren howling in the distance. Did you make a roll? Deacon came over to me. Ah. Huh. Good boy, he said. Who's here? I asked Doc. The ladies, of course. The siren got louder, then stopped. Outside, someone said, Come on backwards. In the light from the windows, I saw an army ambulance backing toward the open door. The car stopped and someone opened the doors. Inside sat at least a dozen smiling Vietnamese girls. The prospectors all stood around clapping and whistling as the ladies were helped out of the car. What happened next defies any description. Once the girls were in the club, they began to disappear. The soldiers grabbed the laughing girls and ran out with them. It all happened in a matter of minutes. I sat behind the bar with my mouth hanging open in surprise. Was it just me, or had an ambulance just pulled up here, filled to the brim with whores who'd immediately been herded into tents? That's against the rules, I said. Hey, that's our ambulance, Doc said. If this happened in the cavalry, they'd all be court-martialed. We got it all covered, Doc explained. Patrolmen would never slow down an ambulance. Hell, that was the best trade we ever made. You traded for an ambulance? Uh-huh. Ring got an ambulance, a truck, and an SUV for one Huey. A Huey. Yeah, for a Huey. One of our choppers that got shot to pieces. They scrapped it, stripped the flight number from all the logs. Ring managed to trade the wreck in. Part of the reason the deal worked out so well is because our mechanics put the chopper back together piece by piece. It looks lousy, but it flies. It's awesome. Ring's head's on fire. Only 15 minutes after the girls disappeared, one of them walked back in, accompanied by her partner. Next, he shouted. Doc clapped me on the shoulder and nodded toward the girl. You like exotics? He grinned. No, thanks. I'm still treating the tripack. I said no. I was very scared of what was happening. These prospectors knew no boundaries at all. You're better. I can't. They freak out every time I try to examine them. He sent the girl an air kiss. Not you, she shouted, wagging her finger. Doc laughed loudly. She left with her new partner. 2 more girls came inside. Silver wings on their chests. America's finest pilots ahead. The Viet Cong are going to lay down to rest before you know it. I completely forgot about the composers. They were still stuck in their corner, memorizing new lyrics and not paying the slightest attention to the intrusion of the hotties. I left the party at 1 o'clock in the morning. The girls were sent back in an ambulance with the siren blaring, but the prospectors continued the fun. Okay, we'll take 2 helicopters. Deacon, pick a crew. I'll take the second one with Daring. The next morning, Ring set up a briefing in the mess hall. Deacon and Daring nodded. I watched them from a nearby table, working on a fresh omelette. Our target is the maintenance base right here. Daring poked at some point on a tattered map. The Air Force maintenance base was a fenced-in field, heavily guarded and protected in a variety of ways, since that was where the civilian contractors stored their mountains of construction materials. Tin roofing, wood materials, air conditioners, refrigerators, sinks, toilets, everything needed to build a full-fledged American base was there. We need the ice maker badly, but we'll take other supplies, explained Thimble. Deacon, you'll cover me when I go down. Warn me if the guards move in our direction. Deacon nodded. All right, let's go. The group of men rose and walked out of the mess hall in full readiness. Ring's Huey returned an hour later with a huge wooden crate on a cable suspension. The crate was loaded into the back of a truck, which instantly delivered it to the mechanics. When they opened the crate, they found another refrigerator inside. But Ring was still satisfied. And by the next evening he had traded the refrigerator for a brand new ice maker from a neighboring Air Force unit. For the next 2 months, every time we went on a mission in the field, someone always had to haul the 500-foot ice maker as field gear. On the 4th day of the break, toward evening, Deacon asked me to fly down to the base and pick up 2 new pilots. I flew with the King of the Sky, who didn't shut up for the entire half-hour flight. He was a cheerful fellow, very pleasant. His complete disregard for army formalities made me forget that he was a captain. We landed on the base's sandy airfield, shut off the engine, and headed for the tent with the mail carrier. From 200 feet away, I thought I knew one of the 2 guys who were trudging toward us with flight bags over their shoulders. "Must be our pilots," the Sky King said. I nodded, trying to make out from a distance the slim figure hunched over under the weight of the huge flight bag. I recognized that gait. "Fuck me," I said with a broad smile. "Do I have to run away from you at the end of the world?" The 2 pilots were 20 feet away. "Damn it! I was promised you wouldn't be in this unit," Wrestler said. I helped him carry his bag to the helicopter.